Welcome back to our channel. In today's video, we will look at how to implement different types of relationships in Entity Framework Core using .NET 7 API. We will focus on three main types of relationships, namely one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. But first things first, let us create our .NET 7 Web API project using Visual Studio 2022. So select create new project. We are going to select the API project. Then we're going to call this relationships demo API, and I just leave it as default. We're going to use .NET 7 and default it to the way Microsoft has that. Then we're going to create the application. So we have our app project created. Now we're going to install the necessary packages that will enable us to use Entity Framework Core. So I'm going to go in dependencies, and I would say manage Nuget packages. Then we're going to just look for the Entity Framework Core. So I think we will just install the provider, which is the SQL Server. And also I think we're going to bring in the tools. Accept that. And now the tools which will enable us to do our migrations. That's done. We are going to set up our models and our data context. So create a folder. Let's call that folder models. So we're going to call that models. So we'll create models, author, book, and publisher for us to demonstrate these relationship types. So let's start by creating the author. Create a class. We'll call this author. And I'll keep it bare minimum because I just want us to focus on how do we do the relationships. So I'm going to have an ID. So I'm going to have ID. And also we need to have the name of the author. Then we're going to create a book model. And this one likewise is going to have an ID. And we're going to have a book title. Then we're going to create a publisher's model. So let's create that class. For this publisher. This will have an ID and name. Now that our models are set, let's create a DB context. So this context is what we use to access the actual database. So it's just a class that just inherits from Entity Framework. So I'll call this app.db context. Could be any name as long as it makes sense to you. And app.db context needs to inherit from the DB context. Then we do have a constructor, and we use the DB context options. DB context options, and this just takes in the name of the context. Okay, my bad. So let's copy that there and bring it here. Options. Let's call it options. So it's simple. Then the base itself also requires an option, so we're gonna pass it there. Now for cleanliness, I'll just do it like that. So there will be some things we need to do when we want to create our model. There are some things I want to do, things like set up, let's say, what is the primary key of a field, things like how do you want to do these relationships. So these things are done via overriding the creating options builder. So what I want us to do first is to override that. So there'll be an override, and it's called on model builder creation. So what will happen here is we're going to, put our configurations. Put our configurations. Could be configurations, could be implementations, whatever you call it. But before we start playing around with those configurations, we need to tell it what tables we want to have. So we'll have what we call a DB set of what we want to have in our database. So we want to have author. We call this authors. You want to have the one for the DB set for book. I'm going to call this books. And we also want to have one for publishers. So publisher. And like so. So within this model creating, we're trying to say, as you're creating, because now Entity Framework uses conversion, so it's a way it does things. But we're saying, as you're creating these guides, we want you to also put there the following configurations. So the first configuration would be, in our models, I want this field to be the primary key, and I want this field to be required, so that it's not optional. So what we'll do here is we'll say we want to write on this model builder. So on the model builder, give me an entity. So we can start with any entity. I'll start with author. Okay, so now we're doing our implementation. So say author. Within the author, I want to create an entity, and like so. Okay. So we'll do it for author, and we'll do it for all three of them. So one for author, one for publisher. Okay, start with book, and one for publisher. Right. So for the author, I want the ID to become the primary key. So I'll say entity itself, I want you to get me the property code has key. So has key just says this is your primary key. So what do you want to be your primary key? So in this case, I want the ID to be the primary key. Then I'll go also to another property which is name, and I want to make it required so that every single time you insert a row in that database table, it should always be there. Otherwise, it will throw an error because you can't have an author without a name. So I say get me the entity as well, and give me the property. And this property should be name, and I want this to be .is required. So this will make it required. I'll go and do the same for the book. So book dot has key, and I would say A, and the book also want the ID itself to have key, as well as make the title required. Then I'll say entity dot give me the property, and I want to play with the title, and in the title I want that to be required. And since author and the entity and publisher are the same, might as well copy and paste. So here I've said, when you go and create these models, make sure these properties are there. So what's next? We want to bring in our first type of relationship, which is one-to-one. We'll use the author and publisher to show this one-to-one, whereby one author will have one publisher. First of all, we need to have it clear that in our models, it has to also know that, okay, fine, an author exists, a publisher exists. So it means if an author has a publisher, we need to link them here, right? So I'll say an author will also have a publisher, and I'll call this publisher get set. And for us to navigate that, we'll need to have a way we'll link that. For us to have a foreign key to that table, which will be called publisher ID. We'll do the same in the publisher to also know that it has an author. So I'll say prop author. I'll also bring in the author ID. Bring in the author ID. Then we need to set up this relationship in our model created so that it knows. So since we've already started here with this entity, we might as well continue there. Then you would say on this entity, right, I would say it has one, and then obviously it has one publisher as per our relationship. So it has one publisher. Then I'll say with one what? With one author. If you guess that, you're correct. So you see that I'm bringing a different order. So this is A for the publisher, this B is for the author. So mark that distinction. Then it needs to have a foreign key. So I'll say has foreign key. And on what entity do we have the foreign key? It will be on the publisher entity. So on the publisher, right? And what is the foreign key there to link it with this one? So we'll go then say on the publisher, use the publisher, rather the author ID, sorry. Right? And something very important is when we delete this, we don't want it to cascade. So on delete, we'll just say the delete behavior will be do nothing. So there you have it. We have linked that as a one-to-one. Very simple and very straightforward. Now we want to implement one-to-many. So how can we do one-to-many? And we're going to use author and books to show this type of relationship. So where one author could write many books. Again, we have to start from the models and really key in and bring this type of relationship. So I'll start with the author. So since an author will have many books, and obviously that won't just be an object, it will be a list, right? So I'll say prop, then I collection of book, right? And I'll call this books. So I'm saying an author will have books. Then also I have to go to the book itself and also point out that, you know what, you're going to have an author. So we need to have an author here, author, and also an author ID, that will be the foreign key. So prop int author ID. Now that this has been done, now we need to also key it in into our own model created. So that will be on the book. That will be on the book as well as so we can do that on the book, saying that one book has many authors. That's possible to do it there. So I'll also come here and say, get me that entity. It has one. So one what? One author, right? Has one. Then I'll bring in. I could say a dot author. So it has one author. But instead of saying with one here, if you guessed it, we're going to say with many. Then with many, we're going to say give us p with many what? With many books, which is coming from the book sector that's in the author, and we're going to have has foreign key, and the foreign key here will be the a dot author ID. Again, I'll put the on delete and say the delete behavior here is going to be no action, and voila, you've implemented your one-to-many. Now let's go to many-to-many. But for us to implement a many-to-many, we use books and publishers. So many books can be done by many publishers, and many publishers can publish many books. But to do this, since it's a many-to-many, we need to have a join table. So this join table usually just takes the names of the two tables, the book and the publisher. We just call it book publisher. And the keys, or the primary keys of that table, will just be the two primary keys of both tables. In this table, there will be foreign keys. So what we'll do here is, we'll first of all create that model. We'll call it book publisher. So create a model, call that book publisher, like so. And within the book publisher, we just want to have the IDs of the subsequent table. So I'll say prop But since we want to navigate that, then I'll have book, then I'll say book, then I'll have book. Then I'll do the same for prop publisher, publisher, publisher. But our primary keys are going to be the book IDs. So I'll say prop int book ID as well as prop int publisher ID. So this guy and that guy will be your primary keys. So now, since it's a joint table, it means from the book to the book publisher, it will be a one-to-many, and from the publisher to the book publisher, it will also be a one-to-many. So we need to go ahead and do that. But before we do that, the book and the publisher also need to know about this table. So it will be a one-to-many. So we have to go to the book itself, and we're going to bring in an I collection. So prop an I collection of book publisher, and I'll call this book publishers. Then I'll copy this and have the same in our publish. Then once we've done that, we need to link this relationship in our entity class, or rather in our model creator. So what we'll do is we'll need to bring another relationship, so I'll say model. But before we even do that, if we are to follow our logic, we have to also introduce it as a DB set there. So I'll say prop DB set. Then I'll call this book publisher, and this will be called book publishers. Great. That's done. Now let's write on that model builder. So model builder, to an entity. Then this entity will be publisher. We'll call this entity. Then we're going to just do the same we did there. Then I'll say, first of all, we have to bring in the key property. So the entity itself has key, and unlike the other tables on top there where there's just one key of one column, in this case we're going to use two. So what I'll do is say BP, then I'm going to say a new, and I'll do this. Then I'll say BP dot publish ID and BP dot book ID. Sweet. So here we're using this anonymous object just to say this tool will be your keys. Then we have to now link that one-to-many for these two. So I'll start with entity that has one. So it has one. Then I'll say BP has one what? It has one BP dot book. Then with many, because it's going to be one-to-many, many. And I could say B goes to B dot book publishers, and I'll say dot has foreign key, and this would be BP going to BP dot book ID, and then I also add the on delete to say that you could use the no action, and we'll close that. So the other one is just pretty much similar. We'll just change the book to publisher and make this publisher ID. So at this juncture we've done that, but we need to create the actual database, and it's not in our table yet. But we've done our one-to-one, we've done our one-to-many, and we've done our many-to-many. So in our app settings, I'm going to bring in the connection string. which is going to enable us to do that. So I'm going to call this default connection. Then what you do here, you have your server. So we use the SQL Server Express, which comes with Visual Studio. We'll call this localDB. LocalDB. Then we're going to have Microsoft SQL localDB. We'll close that. Then we have database. I'm going to call this EF relationships. DB. Then I'll say trusted connection. Call that true. Then once we've done that, since .NET Core rides on the dependency injection container, then we'll have to add entity framework on that container so that we cannot use it anywhere. We're going to use it in our application. So I'm going to say get me the builder, then services, then add a DB context there, add a DB context, and we code that app.db context. App.db context. Then I'm going to say options, and I'm going to say options dot I want to use SQL Server, and we want to access that connection string. So say builder dot configuration dot get connection string dot get connection string, and okay, get connection string dot get connection string. Once we do that, we want to bring that connection string inside of here. Then we can proceed. Then we can proceed to bring that. We can proceed to bring that. And once we've done this, then we have to run a migration. So we'll go to tools, you'll get package manager console, and we'll say add a migration, and we'll say created initial tables, like so. Then once that happens, we'll see that it will show us what it wants to do. So you see here it's creating an authors table. We've got the publisher, which is linked to the publisher ID. We've got the books, publishers, book publishers. Then the next order of business is to actually now create this database. And we do this by just saying update database. Then it will go ahead and it will create those tables for you. And for us just to verify that we've done that, we can say view SQL Server Object Explorer, SQL Server, and then we go to DB, databases. Then we've got that EF relationships demo. And this one should have all those 4 tables plus your migration table, which just tracks the history. And there you have it. You've got those tables. And so, yes, so there you have it. We've successfully implemented one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many relationships using .NET API. I hope you find this tutorial helpful. And if you did, then consider subscribing. And please, if you want us to make free content, please definitely help us on our Patreon page. Would be very grateful, and happy coding.